Good morning, Grid Connections listeners. Today we're thrilled to have Eric Way, the host of the News Coulomb YouTube channel. I originally met Eric by being a guest on Plug and Play TV's live show discussing EV road tripping. Eric brings a wealth of experience from his background of living in Northern California with a Chevy Bolt. In this episode, we dive into the various EV road trip tactics, discuss the rollout of EV charging infrastructure, and share our visions for the future of EVs and EV charging road trips. If you enjoy this episode, please share it with at least one other person you think would love it too. And don't forget to leave a positive review on our podcast page as well, please. Your support helps us bring more exciting content to you. With that, enjoy.
Thank you, Chase. I have a YouTube channel, News Coulomb, pun intended. I started a little over 7 years ago now when I got my Bolt EV, just sort of as a means of sort of communicating my experiences as I got that car, and it's just sort of grown from there. So just News Coulomb on YouTube, and that's pretty much it.
So, what made you choose originally the Bolt EV, or what made you kind of take the plunge into going with an electric vehicle?
Well, I mean, I'd been driving plug-ins for, it's going on 12 years now. So the Chevy Volt is what I ended up getting, 2011 Chevy Volt, and I think I actually didn't get it until almost 2012. But I had been interested in electric vehicles for a long time. It's kind of the story you hear too about like a remote control car, RC car. I always had those as kid, and I was always fiddling with the battery and the motors. So I was always interested, and throughout the early 2000s, I was tracking the industry just as a sort of fan, right? Watching what what proceeded with the GM EV1, the Ranger EV, which I actually own two of now that I'm restoring. Was actually the EV I always wanted. I just, when it came out, it was $55,000. My little head at the time exploded with the thought of how expensive that was. And then early 2000s, I was even planning out some sort of a conversion, DIY conversion, but that's the point. That's the dark ages of EV conversions, when people were using forklift motors and 12 volt car batteries to put together something that had about 30 miles of range if you were lucky. And just budget, time constraints, all of that never worked out. And I considered the Nissan Leaf when it first came out too, and I just realized with its range, I was going to need two cars. There's just no way possible. So I eventually ended up getting the Chevy Volt, and it was maybe the first Chevy that I had purchased myself, and one of the only Chevys my family had ever owned. I was kind of won over by the tech, right? I was won over by how well they integrated the electric motors. As a lot of Volt owners will tell you, the weakest part of the Chevy Volt is the gas engine, right? I mean, everything else about that car is great. And so when I found out that GM was building the Chevy Bolt EV, I was kind of sold on it already, but I knew I was getting an EV, and at that point in time, it was either the Tesla Model S 60D or the Bolt EV. And I basically made the agreement with myself, whichever, if they were able to deliver the Bolt EV by the end of 2016, I was going to go that direction, because, it's literally half the cost. And I was kind of budget and value minded at the time. And I took the plunge and I went with it. So, and then from that point forward, it was just sort of kind of wanting to, like I said, to share my experiences, because I had a unique use case. And that was that I was putting on some days 150 to 200 miles a day. I didn't have charging at home for a lot of the time, so it was either work charging or public charging. So there were really limited options for me, and I needed something. And then, of course, every couple of weeks, I'd go on 1,500 mile weekend trip, and so I needed something that was capable of doing all of that long range driving. Um, and it needed to be technology that I trusted. And like I said, GM had already kind of proven themselves to me with the Volt. So that's kind of where I got where I was going. So, um, but yeah, and I mean, uh, I don't know. Did that answer your question? That's
Yeah,
kind of
no,
how I ended
I
up
think
in
that's
the
a
in the
great
car.
start, kind of jump off point. I'm curious with when you say you're driving a couple hundred miles a day and then maybe you're doing these longer road trips on the weekends. Was that with the idea you'd have the Bolt as a daily driver and then you were still keeping the Chevy Volt for those longer drives or a second car? Or were you planning at that time to do it all in the Bolt as your main car for it?
That was the other thing, is it needed to be my only car. And
Gotcha.
so I still own, like, so somewhere along the line I was putting on those miles, even when I first got my Chevy Volt. So maybe a sub chapter to the backstory is I did eventually trade in my 2011 Volt for a 2015 Volt, a little bit better battery capacity, a little bit more features and functionality, but it was mostly actually the internet, the OnStar, the 4G LTE internet, because where I am currently, right, I'm speaking to you through Starlink, because there just aren't any ISPs where I am in Northern California, where my family and my property is. So I needed something that also had an internet. That's why I went with the 2015 Volt, sort of traded it in. But when I got my Bolt EV, I had made a deal with my family that I took their C-Max. I said,
Oh,
"You're done with this. You're taking my Volt, and I'm going and I'm trading the C-Max in, and then that way they got high speed internet up here, and they had a plug-in hybrid, not just a hybrid. And then I got the Bolt EV. So the Bolt EV needed to do all of that driving on its own. That's why I said early on in my video channel, it's the no training wheels EV. Right, you don't have a backup, you don't have a gas generator on board. There's no training wheels. You're fully committed now. So.
yeah, I think that's an interesting way to put it, especially with kind of the charging infrastructure at that time when you purchased it. But
Mhm.
I know that's something we'll probably be talking more about. So I want to I'm kind of curious. I didn't really fully appreciate how long you'd been driving the Chevy Volt, and just thinking of kind of the current news and what we've been hearing from General Motors. They're still obviously pushing electric vehicles, and they're finally delivering some more now. But there's clearly been a pushback from some of the traditional legacy auto OEMs here domestically about kind of the more tempered approach and doing plug-in hybrids. And I'm kind of curious on your thoughts of the plug-in hybrid versus EV, fully EV debate, and where you think, kind of looking at the market nowadays, what it makes the most sense.
Well, if you brought me on here for hot takes, you'll get one. Uh, Honestly, I really don't see a place for plug-in hybrids. Not anymore. You could maybe make an argument 12 years ago that plug-in hybrids were a valid option. Um, but at this point in time, I see them as essentially a complete waste. You're not any plug-in hybrid that you have, you're going to drive and you're going to realize how much better that car would be if it were just all electric. And that's what you hear all the time from Chevy Volt owners, from BMW i3 owners. If only I had double the battery capacity. If only I had 100 miles of EV range, or only I had 150 miles of EV range, then I'd never need to use the gas engine except in emergencies. Well, that's kind of what the public charging infrastructure is there for anyway. So at this point in time, it's a waste for me, in my opinion, to go down that road of adding an internal combustion engine, adding all of the equipment that goes with it, wasting all the space, all the complexity, all the cost, when you're literally replacing that with a similar cost in batteries and doubling or tripling or quadrupling the range, the power, the capability of the car. So to me, there might be a couple of valid use cases for plug-in hybrids, and it's almost all going to be commercial or heavy-duty vehicles. And really, I see even that as a cop-out, because to me, the use cases for someone who really would want a plug-in hybrid, you're either better off getting an all-electric that's more capable on the EV side, or if that's not good enough for you, and there is a small percentage of the population where I do agree that that's still true, you should just get a hybrid instead. A mild hybrid, because most of your gains are going to be from stopping the internal combustion engine when you come to a stoplight, doing low speed EV driving, maybe a mile or two at a time. And then once you get up to speed, you're running off the gas engine. And that, at least that way, you're saving all of those batteries for more capable EVs. You're saving yourself cost and complexity. But, you know, you're getting all the benefits of a hybrid essentially.
For sure. And I actually agree with you. And I obviously, I think where I'm at here in Bend, there's a decent amount of electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids. But the instant you go east of here or like northeast of here, it is literally a desert charging and weather or
Yeah.
climate wise. And
Yeah.
so I do understand why some people kind of make that choice. And if they are kind of skeptical or hesitant to go fully EV, but you're totally right. When it just seems like the people that do that within a few months are like, yeah, if only this thing had twice the battery range, or they start doing all the
Yeah.
things anyway, that it's you're close enough. And between the maintenance and other kind of points of failures, it does seem to make sense to just go to a fully electric system.
Well,
One,
and
oh,
well, I was just going to close by saying, as an experienced Volt owner, I can tell you for a fact that gas anxiety is a real thing. There were trips that I literally didn't take that I could have because it would have been burning gas. And I just didn't want to be burning the gas at the time. So it's like, well, I could go on this 200, 300-mile weekend excursion. I'd be burning gas. I just don't want to do it. I don't feel like using the money or wasting the time or you're using the fuel. So there is a gas anxiety component to it, because you get addicted to the EV side of it. Just knowing that it's completely replenishable, completely renewable. Yeah, you just don't want to burn gas.
yeah, that's kind of funny, and that does make sense with when you look at even going back further than that, with kind of the original Priuses and people who were kind of doing the hypermiling and trying to minimize how much gas they were burning, and even trying to convert those to plug-in hybrids. So I think
Yeah.
all of that does make a lot of sense. With that, you look at the Chevrolet Bolt being discontinued now,
Mhm.
and there's obviously pros and cons to that, but what do you think for kind of the secondary market for used cars? Because it seems like even brand new, they were pretty cheap. Plus now you can qualify for the $4,000. Uh, I'm not sure if it's a tax credit or how the $4,000 used car government rebate works, but
Yeah.
in that whole space, what do you think? Um, if you were to get a used EV, would you go with a Bolt, or would you look at something else, just kind of given where prices have dropped down for a lot of other used EVs?
Well, I don't know that I would be in the market for a used EV, right? I think I would actually prefer to go the route of a new EV, and I think a lot of that does have to do with the $7,500 incentive, right? So yeah, there is the possibility of going cheap, but I don't. I also don't know that I would go with a Bolt EV. Just assuming that I would give up my car, then maybe. But I I wouldn't be replacing my Bolt EV right now. On the chopping block first is the Volt. So if we want to go
Fair.
from that example, if I were going to replace my Volt with a cheap EV or a used EV, it probably actually, believe it or not, might be something like the Nissan Leaf. right? It's something where I think it's actually more capable than people give it credit for. And it's even cheaper than the Bolt
Right.
EV. And as long as you go into it with the understanding that you're probably not going to be taking long trips with it, it really is for your local runabout. Um, that and you know, Nissan's credit, they do great interiors, comfortable car. Um, but yeah, I haven't really given, to be perfectly honest, I haven't given much thought to the used market because, obviously you could go the direction of a Tesla Model 3. I don't know that I would go that direction. One of the things that maybe I would have mentioned is that, um, where I live, ground clearance is a real thing. And so lower sedans is something that I probably wouldn't want to go with. Maybe a used Model Y would be more appropriate in that direction. But it would definitely be leaning more toward the crossover side rather than the sedan or the smaller car, like an Ionic, original Ionic, not the Ionic 5. I wouldn't go with that either, just because of the size of the car and the ground clearance. So
For sure, and that's interesting because that's actually a big part of the reason I chose our Model Y. Among other reasons, just kind of we do a lot of hiking and just kind of going on. I wouldn't by any means call them off-road trails when we've taken that thing, um, but yeah, easily dirt roads, sometimes washed out. I mean, we did technically drive it over a washed out bridge,
mhm.
but yeah, by no means is it like your traditional off-roader
Yeah.
compared to like a Jeep or something like that.
Well, and I did run into that same issue with the Volt. It's another reason that that's going to be the next car that I get rid of, is the Volt, is because that low sedan, I
Yeah.
was just running into problems with it. So
Now, that is interesting. So we've talked about obviously the kind of why you chose the Bolt and the Volt and doing these road trips and kind of being in remote areas. And I think that's something both you and I have definitely had some experience with. Now, I think one area where we may have different opinions on is around DC fast charging and that kind of experience. Because I mean, for me, that was one of the big reasons automatically the Bolt was never going to be on my list. Is just like for doing long distance road trips or just kind of doing like a splash and dash thing to get to where I
right,
need to be. The 50 kilowatt charging was definitely not just between the infrastructure, but also the availability and the time it would take for that kind of charging.
right. Um, well, and I think so. I went into it partially with the understanding that, charging was going to take a little bit longer. And like I said, part of that came from my experience with the Volt. Is I did some back of the napkin math and basically figured that I would be looking at similar, efficiencies in the Bolt EV as what I was seeing in the Volt, and they weren't too far off. So, and then again, like you had mentioned, even though we didn't know at the time that I got the Bolt EV what its charging rate was, we just knew that a majority of the public charging infrastructure was 50 kilowatt. And so at that point, it really becomes sort of basic math, right? You look at the i3 or the Leaf that were out already, and you get to look at their charging rate and say, okay, well, uh, and just shorthand, in case you're ever curious, the 50 kilowatt chargers will add 23.5 kilowatt hours. If you're maxing them out, they'll add 23.5 kilowatt hours in a 30-minute session. So, just doing that math, you can figure how long it's going to take you. And most of my trips were never more than about 500 to 600 miles in a day. So I kind of was able to do those numbers in my head. And I knew that going from the Volt to the Bolt EV, I was going to be adding about an hour to an hour and a half to those longer trips. Um, and part of that is I would never go on a 10-hour drive without stopping for a meal at least, and stopping at least one or two times to use the bathroom. So when I would do those trips in the Volt, it was typically, two bathroom breaks, two discrete bathroom breaks, and then one fuel stop slash meal stop. That was about 45 minutes. So you add all of that together, it's taking me about an hour or so to make a 10-hour drive, basically. With the Bolt EV, I need to add another 30 to 45 minutes to that, sometimes an hour. So that was a concession that I knew going into it. And unfortunately, as faster chargers became available, which we kind of expected, um, it turned out the Bolt EV was faster than the 50 kilowatt, but not fast enough faster to make a huge difference, right? So instead of 2 hours of charging to make a 500-mile trip, now you're doing an hour and a half of charging to make a 500-mile trip. So it's still losing time, to your
Right.
point. But I do think that the Bolt EV, in my mind, is sort of that bare minimum bar. Because as bad as we can say now in today's framing the Bolt EV is, it's far from the slowest charging EVs available on the market. When you look at things, like the Nissan Leaf, for example, or even the BZ4X, right? Like
Right. Right. Right.
we have vehicles even now that aren't necessarily faster than the Bolt EV in terms of charging, and I do think they fall below the minimum bar, which to me has always been about a 3-to-1 ratio. If you can do 3 hours of driving for every hour that you take off, you're okay. I think anything less than that, and you really do start to run into issues. So, like I said, out of a 10-hour trip, if you have to stop for 3 hours, that's pushing it, right? If you only have to stop for about 2 to 2.5 hours, you're maybe okay. But I think even that standard has changed, right? Just with recent EV developments. So
Yeah, and I'm kind of curious what you would think. I think what you're saying totally makes sense, and I know plenty of people. Uh, and in some ways, I think if level 2 charging was even more prevalent, it wouldn't be such an issue. Um, but what do you think in a let's say instead of buying the Bolt back in 2016, this
mhm,
was today, and you were
mhm.
kind of in the same position of going from a plug-in hybrid to an EV, what would you say is kind of the acceptable road tripping charging time and speed ideally? Because I know we probably disagree on this, and I don't I totally understand how it works and how some people had it, and I've done road trips when it's my wife and I with the
Yeah,
dogs, and it's not as big of an issue because they need to have brakes and stuff. But
right.
even then, like still to this day, my bare minimum like speed has to be, and like even then when I've done some of these longer road trips around like 800 to 1,000 miles, uh, I even think a Model Y is like too slow.
See, and that's interesting to me because I did at least have a chance to review the Kia EV6, and in my experience, and I mean maybe part of that is framing coming from the Bolt EV,
Yeah.
but in my experience, that was too fast. And so when I say that, I did the 1,000 kilometer challenge, the Bjorn Nealon, just
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
kind of run it through the chops, see if I ran into any issues with the EV6. Um, and I spent a grand total, I think, of 45 minutes charging. So and part of that, the trip took longer mostly because of traffic, but I was still
Yeah.
able to average, I think, about 70 miles an hour driving speed. So I wasn't dilly dallying, right?
Right. Right.
So
Right.
70 miles an hour. And I think I spent a total of 45 minutes charging, and I only got to use a 350 kilowatt charger one time. So basically, had I been able to access a 350 kilowatt charger at each and every one of those stops, it would have been 35 minutes of total time stopped out of like 10 hours of driving. To me, that's nowhere, like that's way outside the realm of reason, because I literally had to rush back from a pickup order place
Yeah.
to get back to my car because I was already at like 85% battery. And I'm like, I can't just sit around. Like I barely even got my food. I was barely able to use. One time I literally had to leave without having used the bathroom because the car was done charging before I could get past the line to get into the bathroom. So at that point it makes for an uncomfortable trip, right?
Right.
When your car is outpacing you and you feel this obligation to leave before it's done charging, to me that's excessive. But to your point, some people might feel like that's exactly what they want. They want a 10-minute no more stop and be able to get back on the road again for 2 to 3 hours of driving. um, and to me, I think that's pushing the envelope of what's necessary, though it does satisfy a need. Um, for me personally, I actually think that sort of 2C charging rate that we're seeing right now is about right. The class of EVs that can go from 0-ish% to 80% in about 30 minutes, that's, to me right now, that's the kind of Goldilocks zone. Because we have a bunch of EVs that are like 45 minutes to an hour to charge to 80%. And we have a bunch of
Right.
EVs right now that are 15 to 20 minutes to charge to 80%. I think that 30 to 35 minutes to go from 0% to 80% is about that Goldilocks zone that I personally would prefer, but I recognize that it also might not be fast enough for some people.
I think this is I totally get that perspective of road tripping. And I know plenty of people like that, but I always just like I'd rather have the car ready for me before I am. And I think in some ways that's also why like level 2 is good, because if you know you're going to be somewhere um, for a while or something, then yeah, you can just
Mhm.
kind of plug it into that. And if anything, I'd sometimes like to even see a higher amperage level 2. But and like I said, if it's just myself, that's when I've by far known or like noticed like, okay, I'm waiting. And that does, and I kind of go back and forth. Like if you're only going a few hundred miles, yeah, maybe you only have to charge once or twice, and both should be pretty quick ones, especially if where you're going has charging and you can just plug it in
Right.
overnight. But yeah, it's like once you start getting into like the 800 to 1,000 plus mile day trips, that's where it's like by the end of the day, you're like, okay, I'm tired of like having to. I try to do like just more frequent stops, but shorter. Like just use the bathroom break, go in, and from here to Phoenix, from Bend, Oregon to Phoenix, I think I did it in I want to say 8, but I'm pretty sure it was 9 stops.
Mm-hmm.
I think the reason I say 8 because one of those was like I just had to go to the bathroom again. I'd probably had too much coffee by that point.
Right.
But each of those were like literally try and get the battery as low as possible, plug it in to get that max charge, run in, get a coffee or water, use the bathroom, and then try and be on the road for at least another. I think that's where I've struggled. It's like it's usually at that point, even for like a 10 to 15-minute stop, it's like you're on the road for probably an hour and a half to hour
Mm-hmm.
45. And I think it would just be nicer to see like more of those charging cars in that higher peak rate, or at least hold the curve longer. So you're in the car for 2 to 2.5 hours per charge. Um,
Right. And that's where I kind of see like maybe there's a difference in personal philosophy or whatever, because um, to me, rather than making a 15-minute or 2 15-minute or 2 10-minute stops and driving for 3 hours to 4 hours, I would rather make one 30-minute stop and then drive for 3 hours. And that's where I think the designs of the EVs kind of are are diverging, I would say, because we really do have two different strategies that we're seeing in play right now, where you have sort of the Tesla Lucid model, where it's a super high peak and then a very rapid taper.
yeah.
So you're really incentivized to leave that charger no more than 50%, maybe 60% battery. That adds the number of stops that you have to make, but it reduces the amount of time spent charging.
Yeah.
Whereas the other philosophy that we're seeing is sort of the EGMP philosophy, or we're seeing it from Porsche, and at a slightly lower rate, but a similar uh, breakdown would be someone like GM with their Ultium, where it's not quite the same high average power that you're seeing from Porsche and Hyundai and Kia, but it's the same sort of the charging profile design philosophy, right? Where you're charging at a higher rate for longer, so you're incentivized to stay longer. But
Right.
then when you get on the road, you're on the road for longer, so you make fewer stops. So I feel like as long as people are kind of like, that's the barrier, right? If we're promoting EVs, that we need to get to people who are considering an EV is, what is your travel philosophy and which car works the best for that?
Right.
Um, because yeah, the splash and dash is fine for probably 3 or 4 automakers at most, and then the rest of them, you're going to be wanting to stop for 30 minutes to 40 minutes, but you're going to be on the road for longer periods of time between stops. Um, so I think that's the that's the
Yeah, and
difference
I
that I
think
see.
for
Yeah.
sure, like I said, when it's not me and it's like I'm with my wife and dogs, it's better. Um, and we usually stay a little bit longer at spots, but yeah, right now I'm all about the Porsche charge profile. Unfortunately, the Porsche price comes along with that, but that has
Yeah.
kind of been one of the areas where I've been like I think that's also been a part of the reason I've been pretty disappointed with both Ford and GM's offerings, because the charge rate, kind of like looking at a sea level, just hasn't been that strong.
Hmm.
And I guess I think I'd actually even add Rivian to that.
Yeah.
And the reason I look at those is like, sure, let's use GM. Sure, the Silverado and the Hummer EV like do like 380, but when you
Right.
have a
Right.
pack that's like 200, it's like, yeah, I want to be doing 600 or something like
Yeah.
that. Um, and there's an
But
argument that's a whole different thing. And there's an argument to be made like, okay, are you even saving money, or are you even spending more than you would be in diesel or something at that point? That's a whole nother kind of conundrum. But like even like with the Rivian, which is also obviously a much more expensive product, but even like the Ford Lightning, they both are vehicles with really large batteries.
right.
And even though the Ford holds it, it just seems like it should be able to hold at least closer to 200 longer, just because it's also just kind of shown to be a great vehicle, but not really the best road tripper if you have to stop more than once.
Yeah, and I mean, and I'm probably going to offend some Lightning owners when I say this, but I'm sure you probably saw that race down. Was it I-95? I think it was, with the two Lightnings, one using the
Oh yeah,
supercharger, one
yeah,
using
yeah.
Electrify America with Tom Malogney. Um, they made that trip in about the same amount of time that it would have taken me in my Bolt EV.
Right,
So, not to offend some Lightning owners out there, but it's just a matter of efficiency relative to your charging speed, right? Um, but I was going to say too, that's why it's there. Part of, I think, the deviation in the different philosophies about travel and charging speed also come from looking at peak versus looking at average, right?
for
So
sure.
if you actually break down that average, um, you could use the GMC Hummer EV or the Silverado EV as an example. So a 200 kilowatt hour pack. But if you look at their average charging rate to 80%, they're averaging about 250 kilowatt. So that's more than 50% faster than what the Cybertruck is averaging to 80%. Now you could say, well, the battery is almost 100% bigger, but the,
Right.
the, the deviation in the averages actually aren't that big, right? You're,
And
you're
what
looking at maybe a 10 to 15% advantage in charging speed based on a C rate for the
for
Cybertruck.
sure.
So, but that's when you look at average. But if you look at peak, you say, well, 123 kilowatt hour pack peaking at
No, and
at
I
330.
right, and
That's like, that's impressive. But so that's why I said, like, it's how much you hold it. And
for
to
sure.
your point, if you're driving a Tesla and you don't charge past 50%, your average charging rate is over 200 kilowatt. Now all of a sudden the difference is much smaller, and it's like, well, now you're leaning into, I think, the strengths of the car. um and the concern that I have, though, is how many average consumers want to do that versus do what they want to do, or make the car do what they want to do. And so that's I think the real issue with EV adoption right now is, one, there's sort of ignorance about how each different platform functions, and then there are sort of invalid expectations because of that ignorance. And you see it all the time from journalists who slam
For
EVs
sure. That's
because
a whole nother,
they
yeah.
yeah, they get into a Rivian or a Lightning and they're like, I'm going to drive like a gas powered F-150. No, you're not. But you went in with that expectation. So anything short of that is going to seem like a failure. And,
No, I mean,
you know,
I'm continuously disappointed with the vast majority of automotive journalism, just because it's still so common to see
yeah,
someone use kilowatt hour when they meant kilowatt and vice versa.
yeah,
And it doesn't seem like it's a big thing, or I don't know if they just don't care that much about electric vehicles, but it's like, it to me is just kind of, uh, at best sad, and at worst kind of like
yeah,
against what their journalistic integrity should be, to like know what their job is and realize that it's a different car and it's a different beast altogether. And kind of
right,
having, it's one thing to know about the overhead cams on a V12, and that's great and all, on a multi-million-dollar car, but you should also be just as into it for the Ioniq 5 or something that has and I totally agree with you on the peak versus, because I totally agree. I would settle for a lower peak rate if it held it longer.
right.
Um,
Yeah. The
but at
Audi
the same,
e-tron was sort of famous for that, right? The
right. But it
150
was,
kilowatt flat to 85%. It's like, done.
the problem then is, like, I think if you're going to do that, you have to be a really efficient vehicle. That was the e-tron's kind of failure, was it just unfortunately wasn't efficient.
Well,
So
you want
you kind
everything,
of,
Chase?
yes, I do. I guess that's where I'm kind of like, I feel like we just haven't seen, we've seen new entrants, but we haven't really seen new. I feel like for a long time there was pretty big improvements like every other year, and now I kind of feel like it has stagnated a little bit. And the like most recent vehicles that I've been like, okay, that's cool, are the Porsches, but obviously that comes at a pretty big price. And at the same time, they're not making their own batteries; they're getting them from a supplier. And even the
Right,
Porsche engineers admit that they're pushing it, but they're keeping it within what the specifics of the cells are. And
right.
so outside of better thermal regulation, I don't understand why we're not seeing that from more vehicle makers or more competitive. I think there's been some with the high-end IKEA group, but my pushback there is, and hopefully this is changing, I think this may have changed with some of their newer vehicles, is just some of the issues that they've had in cold weather. And also just, it still isn't terribly consistent to find. Well, and obviously because of their voltage structure, that also has a lot of interoperability issues with finding the right chargers that can max that out.
Well,
Um,
but I mean, I would say that that's not as big of an issue in North America, because Tesla is really the holdout in terms of 800 volt. Because within the North American charging infrastructure, anyway, if it's faster than 100 kilowatt, um, it's 800 volt. So that's one of those benefits that the eGMP vehicles do. They do benefit from that.
well,
So
I see. I'd push back on that actually, because part of the issue, and don't get me wrong, I'm all for 800 volt architecture, and obviously that's what like the Taycan has, and then the Macan is really bizarre because it's technically like 600 volt, but since it's
right,
more than 400, they just call it 800. The difference is the actual charging infrastructure.
hmm,
So many of them are actually, because it's based on electrical equipment. That's why we have 400 volt. That's why we have 800 volt. It's based on traditional electrical infrastructure. And then the systems have kind of been more or less backwards designed to meet those kind of supply chains.
right,
And that, I think, actually is one of the big reasons Lucid's had so many issues, is they kind of did the right thing, but they decided to go with this really high voltage, very specific, pretty rare supply chain, and like EV support infrastructure and charging infrastructure that can support that. And while I think obviously a higher voltage and like 800 volt, whatever you want to call it, design is going to be the future, still so many of the uh, charging infrastructure we have is based on more or less a 400 volt technology. There's some of the ones that EA and others have brought that are higher voltage and offer that. And to some extent, that's part of the reason we've seen some of them have issues, is just around not having the right course. Like, I mean, that's changing a little bit, but that's obviously where you kind of got the thing called the signet surge and all these kind of fun issues that some of these higher voltage charges were just running into, not being able to kind of continuously support those. And I
Yeah.
think that is a growing pain and will change longer term. But in the short term, like, I kind of, it's unfortunate, but I understand why like Mercedes and so many of these other EV makers stayed with 400 volt. Not only is there the supply chain for it, but I think traditionally there's just been a much more consistent charging experience in much more different inclement weathers than if you go with like the full 800 volt and you have to BC charge regularly.
Well, and see, that's why I said I would say, based on my experience, the current is the bigger issue than the
For
voltage.
sure. That's a part of it. Yeah.
And so, and this is something that I'm currently investigating right now, because my Bolt EV isn't letting me do it directly. Um, but it appears that EVgo does have an issue with their Delta chargers,
Yeah.
where they are not combining power the way that they're supposed to. And so they're offering 500 amps, no problem, but they're not bridging. So when you come in with a GMC Hummer EV, you come in with a Chevy Silverado EV, and you expect 500 amps at 700 volts, it's not bridging. It's just giving you 500 amps. So at that point in time, you're basically charging at Rivian speeds, right? You're
Right.
charging at the 500 amp, 400 volt architecture speeds. And that's not how those chargers are designed to work. And now, I don't know if you've heard the same thing, but I was chatting with a certified technician for Electrify America, and he was telling me that that signet surge is a completely different issue. It has nothing to do with the 800 volt. It has to do with the fact that their power modules are flaky. And so
That
what you're seeing is a lot of power module failures in the BTC power units and in the Signet units, and it's causing surges because you have these 50-ish kilowatt power modules that will just suddenly cycle on and suddenly cycle off and suddenly
right.
cycle on and suddenly cycle off. And it's not really the voltage of the architecture, because that's the thing, is literally every single Electrify America site that's in, and this has been true since 2018, is 800 volt. All of them. Like the 150 kilowatt, the 350 kilowatt chargers are all 800 volts. They had a handful of 50 kilowatt chargers that they abandoned. But if you
Right.
look at the
Yeah.
placards at every public charger, basically, that's faster than 100 kilowatt, that's gone in the last 10 years, it's it's the 920 plus volt rating. So I don't know. I see it as being ubiquitous, and the holdup is really that 500 amp, where a lot of vehicles are demanding it, and a lot of chargers aren't able to accommodate it. Um, and if they are, they're not able to accommodate it like consistently. And that was really the benefit that I saw from the EV6, is there's a 4-minute difference, literally a 4-minute difference, charging to 80% using a 150 kilowatt charger versus a 350 kilowatt charger, because they aren't anywhere close to maxing out the amps. It's like
Right.
350 amps or whatever, but they're pulling in 750, 800 volts. And so here you plug into a 150 kilowatt charger and you look at the display and it says 170 plus kilowatt. And it's like, what? Yeah, because you're going way over the placard rating, because the charger was rated based on a combination of volts and amps, and you're just sneaking in where the current is lower, but you're peaking the voltage higher, so you're seeing a higher than rated speed on those chargers. So um, yeah, I don't know. I see a lot of the issues that you're talking about. Like I said, I noted that one with EVgo, where I'm doing a little bit more investigating, because they're building these chargers based on GM funding. They really
Right.
do need to be supporting that 350 kilowatt plus charging of these GM EVs. So hopefully they're taking care of that internally. I just haven't heard anything about it. And then of course, Electrify America. It's a grab. It's life is like a box of Electrify America charging sites. You just never know what you're going to get when you show up. And sometimes everything is 100% perfect, and sometimes they're flaky. I think, did you comment you had watched that Jordan out of
Yeah,
spec
yeah, yeah.
Cybertruck through Wyoming? So that was exactly it. His experience with Electrify America is what I would expect. You go to one charger, and it's kind of peaking, kind of dropping, kind of doing weird things at the power.
Yeah.
You pull into the next stall, 300 kilowatt, no problem. You go to the next site,
No, and
plug
it's
in,
funny
300
because
kilowatt, no problem.
yeah, I did that exact drive a little over a year ago, and I had uh, through I think maybe all of Wyoming where I was driving. It was all V2 superchargers, so I was like, you know what, I'm going to give the Electrify America ones a try. And one of them I stopped at. I'm trying to remember what the town was, but it took me probably 10 minutes to get the app thing to work because of cell connection. And then I plugged it in. I was like, oh, cool. It's doing, I think it was doing something in the 200. So I was like, fine, whatever. I'm happy. I run in to go to the bathroom, and then I get a notification on my phone that like your charging has stopped. I was like, oh, that's not good. And then I go out there and try and plug it back in, and it said derated or whatever. I forgot what the thing it said, but it was essentially the sign saying it was derated and wouldn't go above 50 kilowatts.
Yeah.
And so at that point, I was like, you know what, screw this. And by the time I lost in between setting it up and then having to go back out, I was just like, I might as well just spin on the 150. And I ended up just driving over there because at that point I had to, because it was down to 50. So it was great to see that those have clearly been updated, and he had a much more consistent and better experience in taking the Cybertruck through that. But it was just those things that, and I recently had a really bad experience, and I think I kind of, you watched the recent podcast with Steve Burkett and Walter, where I've just gone like, having all these apps, like it should just be swipe my card and go.
Yeah.
If there's a savings because I go through the app, great. But there's no, like, this kind of goes back to my big thing too, like that extra 5 to 10 minutes is such a time waste when you're doing a road trip and you're trying to like get, if you're gonna have to charge more, like just the plug and go for so many. And I think obviously I'm kind of coming from it from a perspective like I'm trying to get places, trying to move as fast as possible, but then also just from like you look at so many technology disruptions, like for something to take off, it doesn't have to be just as good, it has to be better. And so to me, like plug and charge experience is better than even a gas station where you have to swipe. All you have to do is plug in and walk away and it works. Obviously you have to kind of set it up that first time, but since then I haven't had to touch it. And that's the kind of thing that I think for most users is what would be expected.
Well, and that is kind of interesting because that's the counterpoint for a gas station is you want to get a discount at a gas station. You don't need the app. You just need to walk in with cash in your hand.
Right.
So there is an additional hoop a lot of times, and you get your 10% or whatever, 5 cents a gallon discount by paying with cash. But hey, it's inconvenient, but some people think it's worth it. I'm one of those weirdo EV owners who still thinks that RFIDs are perfectly fine.
I'm going to agree to disagree on that one.
Yeah, because you just have to.
Like, you have to have all this stuff to make it work. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but you have to grab the cord anyway, so you're going to be at the dispenser. That's what I think a lot of people miss is you're already there, right? So just swipe your card and then go. But it doesn't.
I guess what do you mean about the RFID thing? Because I remember with all of those, I had to. If it was like to get the savings, at least with Blink, I think I had to already have ordered it and then have it with me when charging. And so the first time I went to go use it, I didn't have it. So I had to use their QR code, go through the whole process to order it. And then like 2 weeks later, I have it. So I left it in my car and I've never used it again. And that, like, to me, that's a terrible experience.
Yeah, that is. Well, you said the bad word. You said Blink. Blink is actually the reason I completely gave up on public charging with my Volt. Like that Blink experience in the 2012, 2013, 2014, I was like, this company, I'm just never working with them, right? Like it was a terrible experience. When I got both my Volt and my Bolt, it came with a charge point RFID card. I
Gotcha.
still have it, still works. I ordered an EVgo RFID with my membership a month or two before I got my Bolt EV, came in the mail, and I'm still using it today. Like, well, I'm not now. I have plug
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
charge with EVgo, but I mean, it still works. I validated it. My RFID still works, um, but it doesn't break that model of membership, and that's the issue that I see is for mainstream EV adoption. Um, I don't know that the membership model is going to work because I truly believe that a majority of future EV owners are only going to charge publicly occasionally, and it's not going to be at the same network. So if you make 1,000-mile trip and you make 3 or 4 stops, and each one of those stops is at a different charging provider,
Right.
you're not going to want 3 or 4 memberships. It
And
just
that's
doesn't, like,
exactly what
it
I'm talking about. It
literally
just
doesn't
isn't
make sense.
right. And when you're doing like a large road trip, you could be going through different, even when I've driven gas vehicles, it's like, oh, I'm in Nebraska. So there's a bunch of Mavericks. Well, out west, there's no Mavericks and stuff like that, where it's just having to download all this crap that doesn't work on my phone. They have to get my data. And then I'm sorry, I'm going to go on a little bit of a rant. The fact that I have to download this crap, it's a terrible user experience. And multiple times I've had to re-put in my credit card info, and then something doesn't work because of XYZ, and the cell connection is weak. And it's just like, why does that vending machine work over there? And I can swipe my card, and I can't get the stupid thing to work. That's the kind of crap that just like, that's exactly why people aren't going to go to EVs. And that's why I'm like, I'm always inherently frustrated by like an app first experience. Like, give me the option, don't make it a requirement.
Well,
And I don't care if that's an RFID or whatever, like any of those things, those are great perks to have. But to me, it's just such a bad experience.
well, and believe it or not, even Tesla isn't immune to this, and we're gonna see in a few months, right?
For
With
sure.
because with uh, GM getting access to the superchargers, the time frame I've heard most recently is summer, right?
Right.
But GM has this weird issue where the Bolt EV was designed pre ISO 15118,
Right. Right. Right.
so it doesn't have it. All of the Ultium has it natively as part of the CCS1 standard. Well, Tesla opening the superchargers, their plug-in charge now for the CCS NAX J3400, whatever you want to call it, um, that is based on the ISO 15118. So no matter what, Bolt EV owners are still going to have to use an app to
Right.
activate a supercharger. And to your point, that was a frustration when I used Magic Dock. Is I had went ahead. As a good little EV owner, I went and put all my payment information ahead of time. I knew I was going to stop there, and by the time I got there to the charger, they said, "We've lost your payment information. Do you mind putting it in again?" So it was
Interesting.
another 2 to 3 minute process while I'm standing at the supercharger, putting in my payment information just so it would work again. Right. And so, and again, that's not Tesla's fault. It's having an app first access fault, right? Like
Right.
anytime you have that app, that's kind of why I said if I'm going to have a membership, I don't mind an RFID card because at least my phone doesn't need to be powered up. At least I don't have to have cell phone connection. I could be in the middle of nowhere and I swipe that RFID card. As long as that charger is connected in some way, it's good. Um, so I agree with you. Like if you're going to have a membership, it should be plug and charge.
Yeah.
Um, and if you're not going to have a membership, you should have credit card payment. They're ready to go that works as conveniently and consistently as a vending machine. It has to happen. So
For sure. And I think that's why I'm hoping to see more of these kind of V4 stalls and stuff they do. I know a couple of the ones they're doing, not close to me, but ones I would use on a fairly frequent basis are the V4 ones.
one just opened in Weed, so I
Yeah,
didn't
that's
have a
right.
chance.
Yeah.
I didn't have a chance to check it out when I was looking at the Pilot Flying J up there in Weed. But I was talking to this. It's the same installation crew put in both of them.
Oh,
Now
interesting.
the V4 in weed has already been powered up. That's a discussion
Yeah,
maybe for another day, because apparently the EVgo site had its power drop already in place, and the utility still hasn't put it in. So I don't know what's going on there. Um,
interesting.
but when I look in the app, that V4 in weed is not open outside of Tesla's native network. So Ford, Rivian, and Tesla owners only. So even though it's the V4 dispensers, it's still closed off. So, I would have went up there to test them out, but right now it's not even looking like it's accessible yet. So,
Interesting. Yeah, and I know they've been slowly rolling out more and more here and there into the ones that are available. But yeah, there's one in Chemult, Oregon, which is really in the middle of nowhere off of 97 that I'm pretty excited for because coincidentally, I mean, the interesting thing I had was the recent trip I took. I stayed at a hotel, and the hotel had 6 Rivian Adventure Network DC fast chargers
okay.
right there in the parking lot. And obviously, I couldn't use them. And I think the whole time I was there, I saw one Rivian. And I was just like, if this was here, I would not have to charge my whole trip.
Yeah.
But now I have to. And so there was not really to complain, there was a Tesla one about 10 minutes north on I-5 that I ended up going to anyway. But I decided to try out the EVCS one that was a few blocks away and just
Yeah.
had like the purely epitome of a horrible experience. Just everything failed. It had the ticket, the card reader, and clearly it didn't work. And then I just eventually, because it was charging at like 45 kilowatts, I was just like, screw it, I'm tired, I'm getting out of here, and went to the other one. And fortunately, I didn't really need the charge. It was just like, you know what, this would be beneficial.
It,
I mean, I didn't need the charge because I could just drive the 10 minutes anyway, but it would just be maybe convenient, and it just I don't know,
yeah. Yeah. Your
frustrating
test.
to see how much money has been invested in that network, at least from the state of Oregon, and just to kind of still see the state that it's in,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Well, and yeah, it's amazing to me that we're still seeing state funding going toward 50 kilowatt chargers on interstates.
For
I'm
sure.
not one to complain about 50 kilowatt chargers. Um, I think they have their place, but an interstate stop is not one of them, right? If you
For
want to put
sure.
them in a town center,
Right,
like
right.
a
And that's kind of what
parking
this was.
garage,
Yeah.
now we're talking. Yeah, 50 kilowatt, that's fine. You put them on an interstate or a highway even, and it's really, and we've talked about this. I haven't had a chance to actually use EVCS yet.
Mm.
Uh, yeah,
Don't.
EVCS. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, and I
If
mean,
it's
maybe I
working, you're off.
should,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
I seem to be winning the lottery whenever I stop at these public chargers. Like EV Gateway was another one where they put a
Yeah.
charger in Reading. 3 of the units were down. I just happened to pull into the one that was up and working, and I put in my credit card, and it just happened to work. I was like, okay, there you go. I just pulled the slot machine and got some change out of it. So
Yeah.
maybe I should try my luck with EVCS.
I wish you the best of luck in it. I know that they had said back in, like, I want to say 23, maybe it was even 22, that the terminals were going to get a update so that you could use the card payment reader, and clearly
Mhm.
they haven't, which was
Yeah.
one area that was very frustrating. And then two, they have 2 apps in the App Store still, and you have to download EVCS New. And so my
Oh,
phone had EVCS, the original one. I don't know. There's just so many of these things that I'm just like, I don't know, having a bit of a background in that space, and I just like, how, how is this? Maybe in 2012, maybe in 2014, I'll give you this, but like now, like, because I mean, yeah, talking about the blink days and driving an EV back in like 2012, yeah, it sucked, but I was like, yeah, this is kind of fun. It's the Wild West, anything goes, and just if it worked, I was happy.
well,
And
and that's that.
nowadays, it's like after a decade of kind of dealing with that crap, I'm like, no, it needs to work the first time. It needs to work right. And I want to get 5,000 kilowatts. I don't care how much. I just want, yeah,
Well, and that's that chasm, right?
right.
Like early adopters, you could say, hey, we're willing to put up with some growing pains. Same thing with the Bolt EV charging rate, right?
Yeah.
You want to, you're willing to put up with a little bit as an early adopter. Breaking into that early majority for adoption of EVs really means that you can't have a lot of these problems, or if you
Right.
do, they need to be the exception, not the norm. So
And like, let's say even in today that they still made the Bolt, you can still sell those. It would just be like
mm-hmm.
it's around town second car government. I mean, there's a huge market for that, and I
Yeah.
think in some ways they didn't kind of niche it down as much as they should have near the end of their sales. And I don't know. That was when I was like, there's obviously people like yourself who can use it as a primary, but there's still a
Right.
huge market for it as a like second car or around town car or whatever you want it to be, that I just don't think they ever fully embraced enough.
Yeah,
Um,
well, I think the unfortunate part is they wanted it to be their rideshare fleet car, and
yeah,
it's really
yeah,
not appropriate as a rideshare fleet car. That's where I would say it's at its weakest. Um,
yeah,
but for personal users, like I said, I know a lot of Bolt EV owners, a lot of EV owners who have more than 200 miles of base range, who never charge away from home, like
right.
unless they have a free charging on Electrify America, and then they sit there all day.
Yeah, and that's a whole nother problem. The free charging thing, I kind of get why they did it, just to kind of like Tesla did offer it a long time ago, and I think when
But
these
people forget that was an extra cost.
for
Like
what
even when Tesla did that, there was an extra cost involved. Like they said up front, you're paying a little bit extra because you're paying for the superchargers. You're not paying when you use them, but you're paying to help build out the network. Like, and
I get what
they
you're
didn't
saying, but I
they
mean, for the Model S, when we bought it as a work vehicle, like it was the delta in how much how many miles we put on that car, and
right.
to
Oh,
like to a competitive product.
yeah.
I think today you could say that. Back then, there wasn't a delta. It's like, okay, I'm paying 5%. I'm paying $2,500 more. Back
Yeah.
then, in like 2013, I'm buying an EV that can go a
Right.
couple hundred miles, and then it
One,
turned out it could fast charge. We didn't even know that back then.
yeah, I mean they even discontinued the one that couldn't.
Right,
Right.
right, right.
Like early on, like 6 months in, they're like, we're not going to sell this one. It's DC fast charging or nothing. Right. So,
Yeah,
but
it's. I mean, I kind of get that, um, but right, I think that has kind of turnaround, but it just has usually been a bane of existence for other EV drivers, and kind of what we're talking about. And I don't know.
yeah,
It,
and I'm just saying, like it's free charging, completely opposed to it.
yeah, yeah,
But I also see the perception of fairness is different. Where Tesla said we're baking it into the cost of the car that you are paying for. Whereas other
right,
companies are saying you're getting free charging
right.
thanks to a $2 billion judgment against our parent company.
And that
You,
is a very good point.
and that's
Yeah,
when it
very
comes to
different
fairness,
reason.
it's a very different, it's a different outlook.
Well, and
So
that is kind of one of the interesting things. To kind of go a little bit back to what you were talking about around supercharging the plug-in charge thing, that I think, I guess unintentionally, kind of goes back to the example of what I think would be the ideal app thing is with like the Tesla thing. You can use their app if you sign up for their monthly. So I think you pay like $10 to $15, and
mhm.
then your per kilowatt hour charge rate goes way down, or it becomes the same as a Tesla driver's.
Yeah,
And that kind of like I said, that makes sense. Like the inconvenience to like have an app and do all that stuff. If I'm going to save a bit of money, especially if I do it consistently, I got it. I'm in. Um, but this whole like essentially the EVCS experience I just had, I'm just
yeah.
like, no, this
Well, but
isn't going to work,
so here's the thing though, that
especially
13
for
you're
50
talking,
like 45 kilowatts or whatever it
right,
turned out to be.
but yeah, you're talking about the $13 for the Tesla thing, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, but that's a one-time setup. So I wouldn't be able to take advantage of it in the Bolt EV specifically. But if you got a Blazer or an Equinox or a Lyric, right? Those have ISO 15118. So once you set up that $13 thing, in theory, Like when Tesla finally opens it up for
Yeah.
GM, you just plug in. Ford is running into issues, the same
Right.
issues that they had with Electrify America, where you have two competing apps fighting over they're fighting over the bill, is essentially what it is. And it's
Yeah.
the Ford owners who are getting like screwed up by it,
Right.
because it's all, I wanted to do plug-in charge. Well, no, you have to use the Ford app. Well, I wanted to use the Ford app. No, you have to do it. You don't get the pricing. So that's a kind of a double screw up, I think, on Ford and Tesla's part. At least they have access, but in theory, some of the other automakers who get that ISO 15118, automatic um, plug-in charge, it should just pay your $13, get your discounted rate, your monthly Tesla membership rate,
Right.
and you should still be able to use plug-in charge. It should recognize your vehicle automatically when you plug it in and bill you accordingly. So
Well, yeah, and I think there was you're right. There was kind of like the Ford Pass versus the Tesla, and I think I think the way you sum it up is pretty accurate. And from what I understand, the second part is like the data consumption from either of those apps was a big reason that Ford Pass was trying to push back on that,
yeah,
which I kind of get, but like you said, it makes it a worse experience. Um,
right,
and I think most people wouldn't care if it just worked.
right,
They'd be willing to kind of give that up, since most people do anyway if they've got Facebook and Instagram, whatever else on their phone already.
yeah,
um, and I totally, yeah, I think that was a poor execution not to just kind of make that a one and done thing. And so I hope GM does do that.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
because yeah, I'm not
We'll
sure if
see.
that's how it is with Rivian. That
Um,
I don't think it is, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I haven't heard the issues from Rivian owners that
Yeah,
I've heard from Ford owners.
right.
So I think Rivian owners literally might have paid their $13 membership and are just happily plugging in, getting plug-in charge and the reduced rate, and they're going on their merry way. Like,
Exactly. Yeah.
so, um, but
You know. Oh, I'm sorry. What were you gonna say?
oh no, nothing. Go ahead.
Well, I realize we're also kind of coming up on a little bit of the time, but one of
Yeah.
the things I did want to discuss with you, if you have a few more minutes, was
Hmm.
in the Plug and Play EV podcast that you were on yesterday. You were
Hmm.
talking about DC fast charging overbuilding,
Yeah.
and I kind of wanted to discuss that with you, because I think that might be an area we disagree with, but I thought it was an interesting um, mindset, or just kind of like how you were perceiving it. So if you could
Yeah.
kind of just give a quick little overview of your thoughts on that, I think that
Yeah.
might be kind of interesting.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I guess I need to start with saying I don't think we're there yet,
Yeah.
right? I'm saying that I think we are at risk of overfunding the public fast charging, and overbuilding it to the point. And I mean, it's it's the walking definition of like a first world problem, right? Oh
Yeah.
no, we
Yeah.
have too many fast chargers in public. Um, but also it does risk stranded assets, right? You're talking about, it's a lot of expensive equipment that you're talking about putting into the ground, and part of the problem too is, doesn't necessarily mean it's equally distributed, right? We're seeing this in California too, where CARB called out Electrify America because all of their disadvantaged communities that they're supporting just happen to be on interstates. How convenient. Yet half of the counties that qualify as disadvantaged don't have a single Electrify America charger in the entire county. That's a problem, right? So
Right.
there's that issue. But yeah, no, I just think that we need to be realistic about what the actual use cases are. Because on one hand, I see the early adopters for electric vehicles tend to be more affluent. They're the people who can afford to take the risk on newer technology. But those also happen to be the people that both have the time and the economic means to travel regularly, right? They're not working full-time jobs. They're not stuck
Right.
at home, a majority of the time, or at work or office, they're able to take 3-day, 4-day, 5-day weekends and drive across the country. I don't know how many Cybertruck owners I've seen who have already driven back and forth across the country multiple times, right? So you buy a $120,000 truck, gee whiz, you can afford to take 2 weeks off of work and just drive around the country. That's nice. Most Americans aren't going to do that. Right. So we're sort of front loading the demand for the highest users in my estimation. So we're already sort of getting a misconstrued notion of the demand that we're going to see moving forward. But also, there are other factors in play, including we're seeing an escalation in EV range. It's not quite Moore's law, but we're seeing, you go back 10 years ago, with the exception of Tesla, right? You were lucky to find an EV that even had 100 miles of range. Then, five years ago, it was pretty easy to find EVs with 200 miles of range. Now it's pretty easy to find EVs with 300 miles of range. And we know that this escalation is going to continue because it's a selling point. So we're going to get to a point where you're looking at, why doesn't the Model 3 have a 100 kilowatt hour battery pack? Why doesn't the Model Y have a 100 kilowatt hour battery pack? Now you're looking at a 400 to 450 mile EV that makes 30-minute stops and then drives for another 4 hours. So
where can I buy that?
Well, ask Elon.
I know. I'm messing with you though. But I do agree with what you're saying. But
right.
Yeah,
So that's going to reduce the load on these. And also, I should say, so we're seeing $5 to $7 billion just from NEVI going into public charging, but we're also seeing funding from GM, Toyota, Stellantis, all of these other automakers. Mercedes is another big one because they want this brand experience. So once you get everybody just putting in chargers willy-nilly, nobody's really kind of doing any sort of accounting of when have we done enough. And you won't know until you've done way too much. And part of where I think people maybe misunderstood what I said is I'm also counting Tesla's superchargers in that. How many times have you gone on a trip in your Tesla and stopped at a supercharger that was completely empty other than yourself, right? How many times have you gone, and how many times have you seen someone using an Electrify America or EV Go charger where there's a line and they look over at a half full Tesla supercharger? So even in these surges, right, we're seeing extra capacity available. So if we continue to build out at the rate that we're building out, I do see that potential. And, you had asked Steve and Walter, I believe, and I don't know if they might not have given you the answer that you were asking for in terms of NEVI sites, whether they're good enough, right? I don't think that they are. Right? Like, I don't think that 450 kilowatt charging stalls is enough, but that's one more escalation that we're going to see. Right now, if you break down the throughput of the superchargers, right, the V3 superchargers are only 90 kilowatts allocated per stall when the entire site is full. V4 is going to double that, right? A lot of these Electrify America, ChargePoint, EV Go sites, their power levels are being ramped up. So when Walter was saying, hey, look, you're going to be spending way more time than you would in a car, are you really? Like, when I travel a lot, and when I stop at places to plug in my Bolt EV, it is very common that I look around the parking lot, see all of the gas cars that are stopped at the same location, the same Denny's, Starbucks, whatever it happens to be. And when I go to my car to unplug to leave 30 minutes later, a majority of those gas cars are still where they were when I arrived. So I don't know that we're actually going to see that same sort of level, right? You miss all of the people who pull into a gas station, fill up for 5 minutes, and then pull into an empty stall because someone was yelling at them over the PA to move their car. right? So we miss all of the times that people are actually dwelling 15 to 20 to 30 minutes, even at a gas station or a travel plaza. So I don't know that I buy the idea that we're dwelling longer at these DC chargers, especially at travel stops. And that's the one area where I see us needing a 1-to-1 ratio of high powered DC charging stalls to gas pumps. But if you run those numbers, the United States only has 150,000 gas stations around, only an average of 6 to 8 pumps per gas station. And yet they're telling us we need millions of DC fast chargers. To me, there's something doesn't match up there, and I think they're overestimating, or maybe they're estimating the need for DC fast chargers based on 200-mile EVs that are only able to go 100 miles between a reasonable DC fast charging stop. So they're making 8 to 10 to 12 stops on an 800, 900-mile trip. Whereas in the future, I could see those trips happening in, 3 or 4 stops. Look at
Right.
the Silverado EV, and that was the
Right.
3WT that they drove coast to coast, and
For
they made
sure.
9 stops, nine
I think
stops to go
maybe it
2,400
was.
miles.
Yeah. No,
So
I
it's
I
it,
I completely agree with you on that. That I my biggest issue with that vehicle is we just got to get better weight, more energy dense batteries, which is
yeah,
coming along. But that's yeah, and the efficiency of it. But in the ironic thing is the efficiency being bad with that makes it actually a very capable towing EV.
yeah.
Just kind of because of the aerodynamics of it, which is always kind of the counter
But
counterintuitive thing you would think. But I agree with you that I think a lot of the charges have probably been overly funded and to the detriment of rollout because it slows it down because of a lot of these are waiting for the money. I also agree with the fact that there's kind of a mindset around. I think the number you said around the millions to the 150,000 or I think that is also off. But I do push back on the fact is there. While I do understand, like, yeah, sometimes I'll go to a supercharger. I've gone to many superchargers, especially on weekdays, where I might be the only one or there's one other person there. But
mhm,
on a weekend or on a big holiday weekend, it'll be full. Sometimes there's even a wait. Rarely there's a wait, but it'll be 3/4 full pretty commonly. And I do think it's very similar to a gas station or gas. I can think of plenty of times I've gone, I'm the only person there, and I fill up real quick. And there's been plenty of times too where even in the Tesla thing, when I'm going there, it's saying like, oh, there's like 5 open. Well, I get there and there's only 2 or 3 now. So I definitely would push back. I get that perception, but I think it's a little bit more perception versus reality. At the same time, I totally understand why Tesla does want to open it up because then, yeah, they can make even more money given their volume and how many they have of getting more throughput of vehicles there, hopefully.
yeah.
And I
Well,
think one of the other things you mentioned around overbuilding, especially when you think of like lower income and kind of like some of the metrics for some of the builds is right now, hopefully this will change, but it's just so hard and so uncommon for level 2 to be part of multifamily or all these other housing things that maybe you can get away with a couple of cars, but especially once you start getting like the apartment complex side of stuff, it just hasn't really been executed well at scale. Hopefully that changes. And so
yeah,
I
yeah,
think that's where I'd push back that like I kind of get what you're saying about like the millions are probably too much, but I think we still need to see a pretty big ramp to cover for a lot of EV drivers that aren't driving EVs yet. And but that also kind of goes back to the inherent issue. And I think why I don't really expect there to be a good value proposition for a lot of the other car automakers getting into EV charging is that so much of the cost and the ongoing upkeep is to make pretty thin margins. And that's
right,
why gas stations and like Flying J and these, they don't make money off gas, they make money off upsells. And
right.
so I see the big competitors and long-term success for EV charging to be the Flying J's and pilots and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, and just as an anecdote, the longest that 500-mile regular 500-mile trip that I do through California took was a little over 15 hours. That was in a WRX
Yeah.
on Thanksgiving. So just getting to a gas pump took 45 minutes.
And
Um,
I agree. That is
so
something that's
this,
underestimated too.
so that surge is true of both
For
infrastructures,
sure.
and that's what I'm saying. We're not seeing them building gas stations to support a 1 million-person surge up I-5 on a single weekend, but the expectation is we're going to do the same for EVs, and that to me, I have to question whether that's legitimate. And
For sure.
I'll just close on this too. Is as EV advocates, we have to worry about the funding and subsidies getting pulled out from under us. And I'm not talking about government subsidies. We sometimes overlook how private car ownership has been subsidized by fossil fuel
For sure.
industries, because it's beneficial for them if every American owns 2.5 cars with their white picket fence, commutes everywhere, drives everywhere, huge parking lots at retail centers. That's all subsidized. And when they're not making money, that's going to go away. And so, as EV owners, we also have to recognize that the infrastructure that is supporting our individual car ownership is not necessarily going to continue to be subsidized after those fossil fuel companies are no longer making the trillions of dollars that they're making.
Well,
So,
and for sure, I think that also kind of goes to like the whole gas tax thing and the
mhm,
infrastructure for the roads and how do you augment that.
right,
There's definitely some ways I like better than others,
right,
and I think one other thing, kind of going back, I think you're 100% spot on, and this is something I bring up to a lot of people about waiting at the gas stations for like 30 minutes, and I've been guilty of doing it too in my own cars. But I think one of the big opportunities is with electrification is being smarter, and you're starting to see it from a little bit. And I don't want to be Mr. Protest all the time, but one of my favorite things is the fact that it says, here are the superchargers, here's how many are available. And now it even tells me how many people are even being routed to the one I'm going to. And I think that that is a level of incorporation, like talking about like having plug and charge and your billing, where like route planning that figures out, okay, you've got enough to go another 5 miles. Technically, maybe you won't be the fastest charger, but hey, you won't be waiting in line for 20 minutes. And so it's like
well,
finding, and that I think that's kind of the software layer of figuring out like how to optimize everyone that hasn't, that was never even an option in the large and the combustion and gas station model. And that
right,
also kind of goes to where you can be smarter about maybe not needing as many stations and how to do that.
right. Well, and that's where Tesla definitely deserves kudos. Is better than any other car company. They provided essentially guidance and tutorials in learning and development. We would refer to them as scaffolding, right?
Yeah,
They provide their owners with scaffolding. So you want the best EV experience, this is how you'll get it. And they
for sure.
provide it to you. The issue I have as a complete rogue is that don't tell me what to do. But I recognize that I'm in the minority, right? And
It's
if
funny you say that because I'll override it all the time
right,
to do my own kind of way to maybe get places faster. But I think as you're right, as kind of like that scaffolding, as that kind of holding hand as someone getting
right,
into an EV the first time, that's huge. But
right,
once again, even if I say, you know what, I like what you told me, but I'm not going to go that way, the fact that I
right,
can then see in real time, like, oh, this charger another 10 miles is completely unused, I'm just going to go
right.
that and route to it, is that kind of level of data that you can kind of like do through the Electrify America app.
Mm-hmm.
But so much more consistently have I been let down by trying to do that, or it's not enough. It's not an accurate display of how many are actually live or correctly running.
Right. Well, and if you want to
But
look
it's
at
where
it
we can
as
go.
right, if you want to look at it as ceiling versus floor, right?
Yeah,
The floor of the Tesla travel experience is very much higher than the floor of the travel experience in pretty much any other EV. The ceiling is probably not that far off. But that ceiling really requires someone who knows their car, who knows the charging infrastructure, who
For
doesn't
sure.
need to rely on a better route planner or whatever. At that point, right, if Steve and I are traveling in our non-Tesla EVs, our experience is probably not going to be too far off of a seasoned Tesla owner who knows when to override and not to override. But someone who's brand new to EVs, you throw them in a Bolt EV, a Hyundai Ioniq
Yeah,
5,
yeah.
or a Tesla Model Y, that person who knows absolutely nothing is going to have a much better experience in the Tesla Model Y than they will in pretty much any other electric vehicle that they get into.
Well,
So, that is that
and
barrier to entry that's been removed.
for sure. And I think that's kind of an interesting way to look at it as that floor and ceiling model, because you're right. Like maybe the floor of the Tesla one's a bit higher than the other experience for other cars, but then you compare that to gas and combustion space. And could you have there been some that have tried to do some of this stuff? Yes, like Shell had this app and Land Rovers or something a while ago, and it obviously never took off. But in so many ways, the floor of the electric vehicle driving space and where we are just across whatever CPO you want to use is like pretty much where the ceiling is for the gas and combustion space for going on a road trip. And it's just like, okay, I'm hungry, or I got to pull over, so I'm just going to go this random Flying J, versus now I can be a little bit more strategic about it and have that decision and choice that I think is pretty cool. And once again, does kind of help, instead of like going to a Costco and waiting 30 to 45 minutes for gas. I'm like, oh, this place is just as cheap, if not cheaper. And I just go another 10 minutes and I'm fine. I don't have to
You
deal
don't
with it.
you don't like back alleys of Targets?
No,
Oh,
I,
okay.
yeah, that could be another whole podcast about my issues with Electrify Americas and Walmarts and some of the other locations they've chosen. But, and yeah, this EVCS place I was just at was not good. I had to leave. There was multiple reasons I was leaving. One was definitely someone kind of that was there that uh, I clearly they were having a bad day, but I unfortunately did not have the time, capital, or mental bandwidth to invest in trying to help whatever issue they had going on. So
Yeah, that's
that
unfortunate.
unto itself, I think we've had about 5 different podcast topics
Yeah.
in this conversation already today, Eric. But I realize we've gone over time, and I just want to
Yeah.
say thank you for your time. And it's been really
Well,
a great conversation in so many realms, even in little areas here and there where we disagree. It is kind of
yeah.
great just how much overlap we have as EV drivers who've kind of seen like. And maybe I vet too much about how annoyed I have been, but I have kind of reached my boiling point. It's like, yeah, it's been a decade. Let's figure this out already.
Well,
But
and
this has been a great convo.
thank you. Yeah, and our disagreements are mostly about personal preference,
For
and
sure.
I mean,
Exactly.
and how can anybody be right or
Right.
wrong in that anyway, right? So,
Exactly.
yeah,
And I mean, and that's the thing is like, there's been a lot of times I've done a road trip that is like, I don't want to be in a rush,
hmm
and I'm totally in the same mindset with you. And that's where I'm just like, okay, why don't we have more level 2 chargers, or like even a 25 kilowatt DC faster?
yeah,
I don't care. Just something here that scratches the itch versus having to go to a supercharger or something.
right. So,
So
yeah,
thank you,
all
Eric.
right.
We'll have to have you
Well,
again on soon, and have a
yeah.
great evening.
Thank you, Chase.
And I'm sorry, before we do go, like, Eric, what's the best way for people who want to learn more and follow your adventures to connect with you?
Just to, like I said, the YouTube channel, just News Coulomb. I'm trying to post a little bit more frequently. I haven't been traveling as much, been taking care of some stuff, but I'm writing up a series of EV FUD busting. So,
Oh,
yeah, I've got to
I'm
go
looking forward to
rotate my
that. I know I'll
tires.
watch
So,
it for sure.
yeah. So, hopefully that should shed a little bit of light on some less than honest actors in the journalistic space. So,
No,
yeah.
I am looking forward to that too now. But Eric, once again, thank you, and we'll make sure to
All
have
right.
a link to that in today's show notes,
All
whether
right.
on
Perfect.
YouTube or on the podcast. So have a great day.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Chase.
That's a wrap for this episode of Grid Connections. A big thank you to Eric Way for sharing his insights and experience with us. We hope you found our discussion on EV road trip tactics, charging infrastructure, and the future of electric vehicles as enlightening as we did. Remember, if you enjoyed this episode, share it with at least one other person who might find it interesting as well. It makes a big difference and really does help us. And please take a moment to leave a positive review on our podcast page. Your feedback and support are invaluable for us to keep bringing you new guests and great discussions. Until next week, this is the Grid Connections Podcast signing off.